It's August 3rd, 2026, and right now, in the middle of the night in southwestern Japan, thousands of people are still sleeping in their cars. Not because they don't have homes to go to, but because the ground underneath those homes cannot be trusted yet, and because the heat outside has become almost as dangerous as the earthquake itself. This isn't a story about a single bad afternoon that came and went. This is a story about a disaster that is still unfolding, 6 days later, getting worse in some ways, even as the shaking has stopped. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why scientists and disaster planners are looking at what just happened in Kumamoto and asking a question that should genuinely concern all of us. Is this the whole event, or is this just the opening chapter of something much bigger that Japan has been bracing for years? Here's what we know so far, and here's what we're going to walk through together. We're going to reconstruct exactly what happened on July 28th, hour by hour, because the sequence actually matters. We're going to talk about why a shopping mall exploded, and why a paper mill's chimney came down on top of workers. We're going to get into the death toll, why it keeps climbing nearly a week later, and why a heat wave that has nothing to do with plate tectonics has become one of the deadliest parts of this disaster. We're going to explain the actual fault line responsible for this, why it's different from the famous subduction zone earthquakes you usually hear about from Japan, and why part of that fault has not even ruptured yet. And then we're going to zoom out, way out, and connect this event to the far larger, far more dangerous threat that Japan has been quietly preparing for with the United States military just days before this earthquake struck. Stay with me, because the timing of that connection is honestly hard to believe. Before we get into the mechanics of it, I want to take a moment on the human side of this, because it's easy to reduce an earthquake to numbers and forget that every one of those numbers is a person. As of the most recent count, at least 38 people have been confirmed dead in Kumamoto Prefecture, with a couple of additional cases still being investigated to determine whether they're directly tied to the quake. More than 9,200 people remain in evacuation shelters right now, spread across over 200 separate centers. Thousands of homes have been damaged, tens of thousands of households have gone without running water, and an elderly woman in her 70s is believed to have died of heat stroke while displaced, a death that authorities are now weighing whether to formally count as the disaster's first indirect casualty. If that classification goes through, it will mean the earthquake is still actively killing people nearly a week after the ground stopped moving, just through an entirely different mechanism. That's the kind of detail that tells you this isn't over, it's just changed shape. So let's rewind to Tuesday, July 28th, and walk through exactly how this began, because the sequence of events over those first few hours explains almost everything that followed. At 4:27 in the afternoon local time, an earthquake struck near the coastal city of Uto, roughly 48 kilometers southwest of Kumamoto City, on the southern Japanese island of Kyushu. The Japan Meteorological Agency initially measured it at magnitude 7.1, while the United States Geological Survey later placed the moment magnitude closer to 6. 8 different agencies, different measurement methods, and that gap between the two numbers is actually a good early lesson for understanding earthquake science, because it shows you that even professionals working with the same raw data can land on slightly different final figures depending on the model they use. What both agencies agreed on, though, was the depth. This was a shallow earthquake, only about 10 kilometers beneath the surface, and that shallow depth is the single most important reason this quake did the damage it did. Despite not technically being the biggest earthquake to hit Japan this year, here's the part that a lot of people misunderstand about earthquake danger, and it's worth explaining clearly because it comes up again and again in disasters like this one. Magnitude tells you how much energy was released at the source. It does not, by itself, tell you how much shaking actually reaches the surface, where people, buildings, and infrastructure are standing. Depth is the variable that changes everything. When a rupture happens far underground, dozens or even hundreds of kilometers down, a huge amount of that seismic energy gets absorbed and dampened by all the rock sitting between the fault and the surface. But when a rupture happens close to the surface, like this one at only 10 kilometers, there's almost nothing standing between the violent motion of the fault and the buildings sitting directly above it. The energy arrives essentially undiluted. That's exactly what happened in Kumamoto. The maximum shaking intensity reached a 7 on Japan's seismic intensity scale, which is the highest rating that scale goes to. Not a high 6, not a strong 6. The absolute ceiling of the scale, right in populated urban Kyushu. Within the first 24 hours, the Japan Meteorological Agency recorded more than 200 aftershocks. By the following day, that number climbed past 300 quakes registering Shindo 3 or stronger, including several in the Shindo 5 range, which is strong enough on its own to knock things off shelves and crack plaster. This wasn't one clean event followed by silence. This was a sustained rolling sequence, the kind that keeps rescue workers on edge because every aftershock threatens to bring down a building that's already been structurally weakened by the main shock. And weakened structures are exactly where this disaster turned from bad to catastrophic. Let's talk about the Aeon Mall in Kashima, because this is one of the most devastating single incidents of the entire disaster. In the chaos immediately following the main earthquake, roughly 3,000 shoppers and staff were evacuated from the mall into the parking lot. But before everyone could get clear, an explosion tore through part of the building. 3 people were killed in that blast, and for days afterward, 3 store employees remained unaccounted for, trapped somewhere inside a structure that rescue crews couldn't safely enter because of the ongoing risk of further collapse and fire. Roughly 230 police officers were eventually mobilized just for the search operation at that single site, working against the clock inside what's known in disaster response as the 72-hour survival window, the period after a structural collapse where the odds of finding someone alive drop sharply. Nearly simultaneously, at a paper mill run by Nippon Paper Industries in the city of Yatsushiro, a chimney at the plant collapsed. Workers were caught underneath it. That single incident alone accounted for 8 of the confirmed deaths in this disaster, making it one of the deadliest individual sites in the entire event. It's worth pausing on just how fast that mall situation unfolded, because it captures the cruelty of this kind of disaster better than almost anything else in this story. One moment, you've got thousands of ordinary shoppers going about a Tuesday afternoon, walking past storefronts, grabbing groceries, killing time before dinner. The next moment, the ground is moving hard enough to hit the top of Japan's intensity scale. And within minutes, part of that same building is on fire and collapsing on top of the very people who thought they'd already made it outside to safety. That's the brutal, unpredictable middle ground earthquakes occupy. They're rarely just one clean, contained event. They're a chain reaction, where the initial shaking sets off a cascade of secondary failures, gas lines, structural supports, industrial equipment, that can end up doing just as much damage, sometimes more than the earthquake itself. Think about what that tells you about how earthquakes actually kill people in a modern, developed country like Japan. It's rarely the ground itself that ends someone's life. It's what the ground does to the structures we've built on top of it. A collapsing industrial chimney, an exploding retail complex, a road that splits apart underneath a moving vehicle. And speaking of roads, the Kyushu Expressway, one of the main arteries running through the region, was severed in multiple places. Operators reported more than 110 kilometers of expressway closures across 3 separate routes, with officials stating plainly that there was, in their words, no prospect of those closures being lifted anytime soon. Nearly 30 intercity bus routes were suspended. Flights out of Kumamoto Airport were canceled. In a country famous for the reliability of its transportation network, entire corridors simply stopped functioning, cutting off some communities right when they needed supplies and emergency access the most. There's also a quieter, less visible cost to all of this that doesn't show up in casualty figures, but matters enormously for the region's future. Kyushu isn't just a historic, densely populated part of Japan, it's also become one of the country's most important centers for semiconductor manufacturing, home to major chip plants that supply components used in everything from cars to smartphones to data center hardware around the world. When expressways get severed and power grids go down across an industrial region like that, the ripple effects don't stop at the prefecture's borders. Suppliers have to reroute shipments, production schedules slip, and manufacturers thousands of kilometers away suddenly find themselves waiting on parts that were supposed to arrive on time. It's a reminder that a regional disaster like this one doesn't just devastate the people living through it directly, it quietly reaches into global supply chains that most of us never think about until a delay shows up on a store shelf months later. Now, here's where I want you to pause for a second, because if you're finding value in understanding how these disasters actually unfold, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because it genuinely helps push this kind of coverage to more people who need clear information instead of panic and speculation. And if you want to stay updated as this recovery continues, and as we get more information on the bigger threat we're about to discuss, go ahead and subscribe now so you don't miss the follow-up. Okay, let's keep going, because the response to this disaster tells its own story. The Japanese government moved fast. Within hours, a response office was set up inside the Prime Minister's residence, and by that evening, an extraordinary disaster management headquarters had been formally established, chaired directly by Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi. The self-defense forces initially deployed around 3,600 personnel, and within a day that number was raised to roughly 4,600, alongside 480 police officers, pulled in from 11 different prefectures around the country. About 170 of those soldiers were assigned specifically to the collapsed mall site. The Japan Coast Guard sent vessels to support the response from the water. Prime Minister Takaichi later traveled to Kumamoto herself, conducting an aerial inspection of the damage and meeting directly with evacuees in the town of Hikawa, one of the hardest hit communities. This is the kind of coordinated rapid response machinery that Japan has built specifically because it knows, better than almost any nation on Earth, that this is not a question of if another major earthquake will strike, but when and where the next one will be. But here's the twist that's made this particular disaster so much harder to manage than a typical post-earthquake recovery, and it's the part of this story that honestly caught a lot of people off guard. Japan is in the middle of a brutal, record-breaking heat wave, and it hit at the worst possible moment. On Monday, temperatures in Kumamoto Prefecture crossed 40 degrees Celsius for the first time in the prefecture's recorded history. The city of Kumamoto itself hit 43 degrees. Nearby Kikuchi recorded 40. 2. Kosa came in at 39. 8. For reference, that's well above 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's landing directly on top of a population that, in many cases, has no electricity, no functioning water supply, and nowhere shaded or air-conditioned to escape to. Nearly 70,000 households were left without running water in the immediate aftermath, and tens of thousands of those households were still without it days later. Damage assessments confirmed more than 4,600 homes had been affected by the quake itself. And now imagine trying to recover from that kind of physical damage while the temperature outside your damaged, unair-conditioned house is pushing past 104 degrees. This is exactly why officials transported roughly 30 people showing symptoms of heat stroke to hospitals in a single day alone. It's why the elderly woman I mentioned earlier is now being investigated as a heat-related death connected to the disaster, and it's why the government made the decision to start actively moving evacuees out of school gymnasiums and community centers and into hotels instead, recognizing that a shelter without climate control had effectively become its own hazard. Defense Minister Shinjiro Koizumi announced that roughly 300 portable air conditioning units were being rushed into the worst affected areas, specifically to try to get ahead of the secondary heat crisis before it claimed more lives. Think about the layers of this disaster for a second. You've got the initial structural damage, you've got the explosion and the chimney collapse claiming lives directly, you've got the ongoing aftershock sequence keeping everyone on edge, and now you've got a completely unrelated natural hazard, extreme heat, compounding on top of all of it, turning a structural disaster into a public health emergency almost simultaneously. That's the layered reality of what Kumamoto is actually living through right now, and it's why simply saying the earthquake happened, now its recovery, massively understates what's actually going on the ground. Now let's actually get into the geology, because understanding exactly which fault caused this and why matters enormously for answering the bigger question hanging over this entire video. The earthquake was traced to the Hinagu Fault zone, a roughly 80-kilometer-long strike-slip fault system that runs through central Kyushu. Scientists at Tohoku University determined that the rupture occurred specifically along the northeastern section of that fault, known as the Takano Shirahata to central Hinagu segment. Now, if that name sounds even vaguely familiar, there's a reason for that. This is the same broader fault system, the Futagawa-Hinagu system, that produced the devastating 2016 Kumamoto earthquakes, a sequence that killed roughly 270 people across two major shocks within about 28 hours of each other. This region has a documented painful history with exactly this kind of rupture. Here's the detail that seismologists are watching closest right now, and it's the piece of this story that genuinely deserves its own spotlight. When a fault ruptures, it doesn't just release the built-up stress on the section that broke. It redistributes stress onto the neighboring, still-locked sections of that same fault, sometimes making them more likely to rupture, not less. Tohoku University's Shinji Toda explained that while this earthquake relieved built-up strain along the section that slipped, it simultaneously loaded additional stress onto the segments sitting right next to it. The section that ruptured back in 2016 sits just to the north, and because it already released its energy a decade ago, researchers consider the odds of that particular stretch rupturing again anytime soon to be relatively low. But south of where this new rupture occurred, in the Yatsushiro Sea, sit the Yatsushiro segment and the southwestern portion of the Hinagu Fault. Those sections have not slipped. They remain fully locked, still holding all their accumulated stress, and now potentially carrying additional stress transferred over from the section that just broke. Experts have explicitly stated that the risk of further significant shaking along this fault system has not been eliminated. If anything, it's been sharpened. I want you to sit with that for a second, because this is the exact mechanism that made the 2016 Kumamoto sequence so brutal in the first place. Back then, a magnitude 6, 5 foreshocks struck along the northern Hinagu Fault, and everyone assumed that was the main event. Then, roughly 28 hours later, a much larger magnitude 7. 3 main shock ripped through, this time rupturing over onto the neighboring Futagawa Fault as well. And that second, larger quake did the overwhelming majority of the damage and killed the overwhelming majority of the victims. Japan learned in the most painful way possible that the first big shake in one of these sequences is not automatically the worst one. Sometimes it's the warning shot. So that brings us to the actual title of everything we're discussing today, the reason disaster researchers and government planners are treating this Kumamoto earthquake as something bigger than a single isolated regional event. Because this earthquake did not happen in isolation, It happened in the middle of what has become an unusually active stretch of seismic years for Japan. Go back to January 2024, and you've got the Noto Peninsula earthquake, a magnitude 7.6 event that devastated the Noto region and killed hundreds. Move forward to August 2024, and southern Kyushu was struck by the magnitude 7, 1 Hyuga Nada earthquake, an event so significant that it triggered Japan's very first ever Nankai Trough megaquake advisory, sending the country into a week of nervous, uncertain waiting. Fast forward to April of this year, 2026, and the Sanriku coast off northeastern Japan was hit by a magnitude 7, 4 to 7. 5 earthquake along the Japan Trench, strong enough to trigger evacuation orders for roughly 44,000 people, and a tsunami warning that sent coastal residents scrambling for higher ground. And now, just months later, Kumamoto, 4 major damaging earthquakes across 2.5 years, striking different fault systems in different parts of the country. That's not the kind of frequency Japan considers routine, even for a nation this seismically active. And here's where the story gets genuinely eerie in its timing. In the week immediately before this Kumamoto earthquake struck, American and Japanese forces were actively running a joint military exercise called Rescue 2026, conducted at Yokota Air Base and at Camp Ichigaya, the headquarters of Japan's Ministry of Defense in Tokyo. The entire premise of that exercise was to simulate the coordinated disaster response to a magnitude 8 to 9 earthquake, striking along the Nankai Trough, followed by a massive tsunami hitting southern and central Japan. This wasn't some abstract, theoretical worst-case scenario dreamed up for a training manual. Japan's own Earthquake Research Committee currently estimates there's a 70 to 80% probability of a magnitude 8 or 9 earthquake occurring along the Nankai Trough within the next 30 years. That's not a maybe. That's closer to a coin flip stacked heavily toward yes on a geological system that Japan's government has explicitly modeled as potentially catastrophic. Their own worst-case damage estimate, published back in 2013 and still the reference point used today, projects that a full Nankai Trough rupture could generate a tsunami exceeding 33 feet within minutes of the shaking starting, kill as many as 323,000 people, destroy more than 2 million buildings, and cause economic damage exceeding 200 trillion yen, somewhere north of $2 trillion. So while soldiers were literally rehearsing the response to that exact nightmare scenario in Tokyo, a real, live, damaging earthquake was tearing through Kyushu less than a week later. That's the kind of coincidence that makes the phrase, "this is a beginning," feel less like clickbait and more like a genuinely uncomfortable possibility worth examining honestly. Now, before you assume this means the Kumamoto earthquake directly triggered or is somehow mechanically connected to the Nankai Trough, let's be precise about the actual science here. Because precision matters more than fear in a story like this one. The Hinagu Fault is a shallow, inland, strike-slip crustal fault. It sits within Kyushu itself, above the subduction zone, not on it. The Nankai Trough, by contrast, is a completely different kind of fault system entirely. A massive offshore subduction zone stretching from central Honshu down through Shikoku and toward Kyushu, where one tectonic plate, the Philippine Sea Plate, is being forced underneath the Eurasian Plate. These are not the same fault. There is no confirmed direct mechanical link where a rupture on one automatically triggers a rupture on the other. Seismologists have not identified a causal chain connecting this specific Kumamoto event to an imminent Nankai Trough rupture. And it's important to say that clearly, because sensationalizing a connection that hasn't been scientifically established would be doing exactly what responsible disaster reporting should avoid. But here's the more honest, more nuanced version of the concern, and it's the version that actually matters. Japan sits at the intersection of 4 major tectonic plates: the Pacific Plate, the Philippine Sea Plate, the North American Plate, and the Eurasian Plate, which is precisely why it experiences such a staggering volume of seismic activity in the first place, roughly 100 felt earthquakes every single year, and around 20% of every magnitude 6 or higher earthquake that happens anywhere on the planet. Multiple independent fault systems across this country are simultaneously sitting under significant accumulated stress right now, not because they're mechanically linked to one another, but because Japan as a whole occupies one of the most tectonically loaded pieces of real estate on Earth, and long, quiet faults across the country have been reaching their statistical breaking points in relatively close succession over the past few years. The Nankai Trough segment, specifically, has not ruptured in its full length since 1946, meaning it's now been building strain, uninterrupted, for 8 decades. And that 80-year gap actually matters more than it might sound, because this particular trough has a documented, almost rhythmic history of producing massive earthquakes roughly every 100 to 150 years. The Ansei Nankai earthquake struck in 1854, devastating huge stretches of the Pacific coastline, Roughly 90 years later, in December 1944, the Nankai earthquake ruptured a large portion of the trough, followed just 2 years after that in 1946 by the Nankai earthquake itself, a magnitude 8. 4 event that killed over 1,300 people and sent tsunami waves crashing into coastal towns across western Japan. Scientists studying this fault system have long pointed out that the 1944 and 1946 ruptures, while enormous, didn't actually release the full accumulated strain sitting along the entire trough, meaning some segments were essentially left partially loaded even after those disasters. 80 years is right in the middle of this fault's known historical rhythm, not the beginning of the window, and not obviously past it either, which is precisely why Japanese seismologists describe the current period as one where the probability is elevated rather than treating any single earthquake as some kind of definitive final warning bell. When you combine that reality with the fact that Japan just ran a full-scale joint military rehearsal for exactly that scenario, and then watched a real, damaging, multi-fatality earthquake strike less than a week later on a completely different but equally significant fault, you understand why officials and citizens alike are treating Kumamoto not as an unrelated freak event, but as a fresh, painful reminder that the broader threat they've been preparing for hasn't gone anywhere. It's exactly why the government didn't wait around before mobilizing thousands of troops and declaring an extraordinary disaster headquarters within hours. They already knew, going into this, exactly what a delayed response to a major quake can cost. There's actually a really important comparison worth drawing here because it says something powerful about how much Japan's preparedness genuinely matters, even when things go badly. Earlier this year, when that magnitude 7.4 to 7, 5 earthquakes struck off the Sanriku coast in April, tsunami warnings were issued, tens of thousands of people evacuated to higher ground, and the shaking was reportedly felt for as long as 7 minutes across a huge stretch of the country. And when the dust settled on that event, the final damage report came back to roughly 200 power outages, 2 people injured from falls, and 0 deaths. 0. A magnitude 7. 4. A tsunami warning, and effectively no fatalities because of decades of investment in strict building codes, early warning systems, and a population trained from elementary school onward to respond to shaking instinctively and correctly. Compare that to what's happening in Kumamoto right now, where a technically smaller magnitude event has produced dozens of deaths, mostly because it struck a shallow inland fault directly beneath populated areas with almost no warning time at all. The kind of earthquake that even the best early warning systems in the world struggle to give more than a few seconds notice for, because the source is simply too close to the surface and too close to the people standing above it. Depth and proximity, over and over again, turn out to matter just as much as raw magnitude when you're trying to understand why one earthquake kills nobody and another kills dozens. So what does "it's a beginning" actually mean here, stripped of the hype and looked at honestly? It doesn't mean scientists have found direct evidence that Kumamoto is mechanically setting off the Nankai Trough megaquake. That specific causal claim isn't supported by what's currently known, but it does mean several things that are genuinely true and genuinely worth taking seriously. It means the recovery itself is only beginning, with thousands of people still displaced, tens of thousands of households still without water, a heat wave actively working against every rescue and rebuilding effort, and a death toll that officials themselves admit could still climb as heat-related casualties get formally reviewed and added. It means the seismic sequence on the Hinagu Fault itself may only be beginning, with an unruptured southern segment sitting there, loaded with fresh stress transferred over from the section that just broke, exactly mirroring the pattern that made the 2016 disaster so much worse than anyone initially expected. And it means, on the broadest possible level, that this is one more data point in what is clearly an unusually active seismic period for Japan as a whole, a period unfolding at the exact same time the country's own scientists are telling its own citizens that the odds of the nation's most catastrophic feared earthquake happening within the next 3 decades sit at roughly 3 and 4. None of that is an excuse for panic, and it's genuinely important to say that plainly. Japan has, without question, the most sophisticated earthquake early warning infrastructure and the strictest seismic building codes on the entire planet, and both of those systems are actively saving lives every single time an earthquake strikes there, including this one. Rescue crews reached the collapsed mall within minutes. The government stood up a full national disaster response within hours. Aid, water, and cooling equipment are being pushed into the affected region as fast as logistics allow. This is what a well-prepared nation's response to disaster actually looks like in practice, even when the disaster itself is severe. But preparation and inevitability are 2 different things, and Japan's own government is telling its own population, through official advisories, and now through joint military exercises, rehearsing the absolute worst-case tsunami scenario, that the bigger event is not a question of whether, but of when. If you live anywhere near a coastline, if you have family in Japan, or honestly, if you simply live in any earthquake-prone region of the world, the actual practical takeaway from everything happening in Kumamoto right now isn't fear. It's the same handful of boring, unglamorous preparation steps that experts have been repeating for years and that genuinely work when the moment comes. Know where your nearest evacuation shelter is. Keep a few days of water, food, and basic medical supplies set aside somewhere accessible. Have a way to communicate with family if cell networks go down, because they often do in the first chaotic hours. Secure heavy furniture and know where your utility shutoffs are. These sound almost too simple to matter, right up until the moment they're the entire difference between someone getting through a disaster safely and someone not making it out at all. Japan's own history proves this isn't theoretical advice dressed up to sound reassuring. Go back to the April earthquake off Senriku, where tens of thousands evacuated calmly to higher ground because they'd rehearsed exactly that response for years. And the result was 2 minor injuries out of a population of millions who felt the shaking. Then look at nations without that same depth of preparation, where earthquakes of similar or even smaller magnitude have produced death tolls in the thousands or tens of thousands, not because the geology was worse, but because the buildings, the warning systems, and the public training simply weren't there when the ground finally moved. The gap between those outcomes has nothing to do with luck, and everything to do with decisions made years, sometimes decades, before anyone knew exactly which Tuesday afternoon the fault would finally give way. Kumamoto is still counting its dead. It's still pulling people out from underneath a collapsed shopping mall roof and a fallen factory chimney. It's still watching its own thermometers climb past temperatures the prefecture has never recorded before in its history, all while thousands of displaced families try to survive in cars and gymnasiums without water or power. And in the background of all of it sits a fault line to the south of the rupture that hasn't broken yet, and a much larger, much more dangerous trough offshore that Japan's own scientists say has a real, serious, non-trivial chance of unleashing the most devastating earthquake the country has ever modeled, sometime within the next generation. Whether or not this specific earthquake turns out to be scientifically connected to that larger threat, it has absolutely functioned as a wake-up call, a live, painful reminder playing out in real time of exactly what's still sitting there, waiting underneath one of the most seismically active countries on Earth. So here's the question I want to leave you with, and I'd genuinely like to hear your take in the comments below. Do you think a disaster like this one changes how seriously a country prepares for the bigger threat still looming? Or does the memory of an event like Kumamoto tend to fade the moment the news cycle moves on to the next story? Let me know what you think down below, and if this kind of clear, detailed breakdown is something you want more of, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it when the next update comes in, because between the ongoing Kumamoto recovery and the broader Nankai Trough risk, this is very likely a story we'll be coming back to. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.